What then shall we say, that the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. For I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. All right. Somebody want to pick up on James chapter 2? Read that one for us.
9 through 13.
Yep.
But if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the whole law yet stumbles in one point, he has become guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not commit murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery, but do commit murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. For judgment will be merciless to one who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment.
I put two other passages beside this one, Leviticus 19:13 to 18 and Exodus 20:13 and 14. I've got the Leviticus one up right now, so I'm going to go ahead and read that. You shall not oppress your neighbor nor rob him. The wages of a hired man are not to remain with you all night until morning. You shall not curse a deaf man nor place a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall revere your God. I am Yahweh. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great, but you are to judge your neighbor fairly. You shall not go about as a slanderer among your people, and you are not to act against the life of your neighbor. I am Yahweh. You shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. You may surely reprove your neighbor, but shall not incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the sins of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahweh. I wanted to read that passage along with this James passage, because James references it twice in these verses. Actually, the verse before the ones that you read, Timothy, in verse 8, is where he starts with, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's a quote from Leviticus 19. But then he goes on to talk about partiality, which comes from that same chapter. So it seems pretty clear to me that James is thinking of Leviticus chapter 19. He wouldn't have thought of it as chapter 19, of course. But he's thinking of this passage where Leviticus is addressing being, mistreating your neighbor, showing partiality, treating your rich neighbor better than your poor neighbor, or vice versa, because either way is wrong. And then Exodus 20, this passage is going to be more familiar to everybody. Exodus 20, verses 13 and 14. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery. Those are two other commandments that James mentions in that letter. And the reason I want to include both of these references, not just because James quotes them, but because James clearly considers them both part of the same law. Exodus 20 is the Ten Commandments. And as Christians, we frequently like to set the Ten Commandments apart as if it's a separate law all to itself. Many Christians will say, well, we need to keep the Ten Commandments, except that fourth one, but we don't need to keep the rest of the law. Well, James is saying that if you violate any part of the law, including Leviticus, it's the same as violating all of it. You are equally a sinner no matter which commandment you break. So they're all part of the same law. All right, let's go back to Romans 7:7. Is the law sin? What is he really asking there?
Is the fact that there is a standard, is that standard a problem or not? I think that's what sort of he's pointing to.
Yeah, and this standard in particular. People do like to say that your truth isn't my truth, or, your morality isn't my morality, those kinds of things. But God's law doesn't work that way. There's only one law. Now, some commandments may or may not apply to you, but it's all the same set of laws. And you don't get to pick and choose which ones are still valid for you. The whole thing is valid. And as James points out, it's either all or nothing. And some people will even go so far as to say that if you are trying to keep the law, then you are in sin. It is a sin to keep the law. But Paul says very plainly, by no means is the law sin. Heck no. Paul hasn't sinned. That's silly. And then he says, but if it had not been for the law, I wouldn't even know what sin is. And we just got through in the previous chapter with Paul saying over and over, should we go on sinning? No, sin is a bad thing. Don't sin. And, we had some of that earlier in Romans 7 too. Even going all the way back to Romans 1, the litany of wickedness in the world. The only reason we know that all of these things are wicked is because God said so. And where did he say so? In the law. If Paul is saying that he would not even have known what it is to sin if the law didn't tell him what sin is, and then he says that we are not to go on sinning, he wrote that earlier in Romans, what does that mean about the law as it relates to a Christian? What do you think the role of the law is in your life?
Guidelines for living.
Yeah, guidelines for living.
Standards.
Mm-hmm.
You know what it reminds me of, besides the UCMJ, is code books. There's building codes and different driving codes, and I had asked a question of somebody that I was just kind of bouncing things back and forth with. How many thousandths of an inch are you allowed to have on the steer tire of a heavy truck to go down the highway? How much was the DOT require? And he goes, oh, I have no idea. I said, oh, okay, so it doesn't apply. It's a traffic code. So if you get a speeding ticket, you've broken the traffic code. You have specifically broken this element of it, but you have breached the codes. In the same way, if you're like, I've done fire protection piping and there's codes there, electric, whatever. And if you do something wrong in that element of it, that's a statute, 1-1.1 or whatever. You have still broken the code book. So the same thing with this, with the scriptures. If you break an element of it, you have broken it. So obviously there's different levels of correction and discipline, but
yeah. And it also doesn't matter that you didn't know that was in the code. You still broke it. Now, once you know it's in the code and then you go and break it anyways, penalties may be more severe. There's, that's a bigger problem, but it doesn't mean that you didn't break it when you didn't know it.
Well, typically the codes are for our protection and we go overboard in our society, but God's not gone overboard. The codes that his law establishes are for our protection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, same idea. He actually has some building codes in his commandments too, although they're not nearly as detailed as the ones we find in our own law books.
I think it's more than just rules, or it's invitation to relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, can you expand on that? Tell me a little bit more of what you mean.
It's the ketubah, right? It's the marriage contract. It was his invitation to the Israelites to be his people, and he would be their God. It was the way that they were going to relate to each other, in a way that we weren't just violating his boundaries.
Yeah, from one angle, it's like a ketubah where, if we are coming into relationship with God, this is how he expects us to behave in his house. And using a different metaphor of adoption, it's the same basic thing. We're being adopted into his house. Well, his house has established rules. The rules have always been there. And now that we're coming into his house, becoming members of that household, it's up to us to learn those rules. And when we know him, of course, we will know his rules instinctively the better we know him. But on the other hand, the rules also help us to get to know him better. So, kind of a positive feedback loop.
I don't know why, but I was in Deuteronomy 5. I don't know if you put it up there or whatever. But she had mentioned that marriage thing. And it's interesting because when Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and ordinances which I am speaking today in your hearing, that you may learn them and observe them carefully. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb, and the Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, all of you alive today. And the Lord spoke with you face to face," etc. And then goes on in verse 10, but showing loving kindness, which is grace, to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. And then he goes on to talk about the specifics, but that was that covenant marital style relationship that men and women are supposed to picture in their home. But yeah.
And any covenant ought to have, it comes with its own set of rules. Like, it's not just that you're saying, hey, we're going to have a relationship and then you both go walk away. you have to define the relationship. Otherwise, what's the point? And God does the same thing with his covenants with us. He doesn't create a covenant with us just so we can pal around. He makes this covenant so that he can define our relationship and say, here's how interaction is going to work. And we all do that when we make marriage vows, even if it's just for civil benefits like, health insurance or, sharing utility bills or whatever it is. There are still some established boundaries and rules that everybody has to go through in order to be part of that relationship.